welcome to today's Breakfast Bite. We're delighted to have you join us here this morning. So, as many of you know, our Breakfast Bites are designed to give small food businesses practical, easy to understand advice on the topics that matter most to you. So, today's session is all about the FSAI's Guidance Note 45 on how to implement a robust Listeria Environmental Monitoring Programme, or LEM, in ready-to-eat food businesses. So we'll be walking you through what's in the guidance note and what it means for food businesses like yours. And joining me today is my colleague, Dr. Mary Lenihan, Senior Technical Executive, Biological Safety here at the FSAI. And Mary will give you an overview on how to use a risk-based approach to develop an LEM programme. So this will include using the expertise and insights of staff working in your business to determine which location should be swabbed for Listeria and how frequently. Mary will also explain how to test the results, how the test results should be interpreted and what actions to take in the event of Listeria being detected. So behind the scenes today, we also have our colleagues from the communications team and the food safety and training and compliance team and the biological safety team, ensuring everything runs smoothly for us. So the webinar this morning will last around 40 minutes in total, with about 30 minutes for Mary's presentation, and then that'll be followed by 10 minutes for your questions. So if you do have any questions, please type them into the questions box into the chat there as we go along, and we'll address them at the end. And lastly, if you're on social media, we'd encourage you to engage with us using the hashtag FSAI events. And now, without further ado, I'll pass you on to Mary. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Welcome this morning to this morning's webinar on how to implement a robust Listeria Environmental Monitoring, or LEM, programme. For today's presentation, I was going to cover what is Listeria monocytogenes, what is a LEM programme, how do you use it to manage the risk of Listeria monocytogenes environmental contamination, what is the seek and destroy approach, and then the second half of my presentation is going to give you a quick overview of Guidance Note 45, and in particular, the 6 steps to implement a robust LEM programme. So Listeria monocytogenes is a pathogen, and it can cause serious illness called listeriosis. It's usually acquired by eating contaminated food, but thoroughly cooking food will fully destroy Listeria monocytogenes. So for this reason, there's a higher risk associated with ready-to-eat food, which is eaten without fully cooking first. Listeria monocytogenes poses a particular risk to people in the vulnerable groups, such as older adults, people with weakened immune systems, pregnant women, and neonates. And in Ireland, on average, each year we have about 14 to 22 cases of listeriosis reported. Listeria monocytogenes is widely distributed in the environment, and it has been isolated from a variety of habitats, including soil, vegetation, silage, sewage, water, and the feces of animals and humans. What sets it apart from other pathogenic bacteria is its ability to survive and grow very slowly at moist, cold environments. So it's typical environments that you find in the food processing facilities. For this reason, it's vital that food business operators have a robust food safety management system, and as part of that, an LEM programme to manage the risk of Listeria monocytogenes cross-contamination to food from the environment. Chilled ready-to-eat foods are more likely to be contaminated, and some of the foods have physiochemical characteristics that support the growth of Listeria monocytogenes to levels that may cause illness. Another type of contamination that can happen in the food processing environment is post-process contamination, particularly of cooked ready-to-eat foods. So Listeria monocytogenes may have come in the raw material, and that is cooked, and then after cooking, the cooked food gets recontaminated with Listeria monocytogenes from the environment. So for example, types of foods would be like deli meats. Another source of listeriosis can be contaminated non-ready-to-eat foods, such as ready meals that are contaminated with Listeria monocytogenes, and then they are not fully cooked before eating. So this could be due to consumer preference for the food looks cooked, so they don't follow the cooking instructions and they prefer it just warmed up. Or it could be because the cooking instructions labeled on that product are not adequate to ensure a full reheat. Listeriosis causes 2 different types of disease, an invasive disease and a non-invasive disease. The non-invasive disease is more typical in people with healthy immune systems, and the symptoms are more like a gastrointestinal symptoms, so it's vomiting, nausea, persistent fever, kind of feeling a bit fluey, can resemble very closely flu-like symptoms. But for people in the vulnerable groups, they are much more likely to suffer very severe symptoms. And for pregnant women, this could be risk of premature labour, meningitis in the newborn, or possibly miscarriage. For other people in the vulnerable groups, they're also at risk of septicemia, meningitis, and in some rare cases, it can be fatal. This slide is showing you data from the EU One Health report from data from 2023 and 2024. And the reason I wanted to show you this is to highlight that listeriosis is the 5th most commonly reported foodborne illness across Europe. And you can see there in the data that's highlighted by the red boxes, the numbers of listeriosis cases are growing year on year. And in particular, I wanted to show you that in comparison to the other diseases, foodborne diseases, listeriosis, it has a very high hospitalization rate and a very high case fatality rate. So the symptoms of listeriosis are very severe, even though you have lower numbers of cases compared to the other illnesses. So that's why we're so concerned about it. Add to this that Ireland's population is actually becoming more susceptible to listeriosis. And this data comes from the Central Statistics Office in Ireland, which shows in the last 10 years, the number of people over 65 is steadily growing. And this trend is set to continue well into the future. And in particular here, you can see highlighted that the number of people who are going to be in their 80s and above is really set to continue into the future. So, it's really vital that we can ensure that the food that these populations are eating is safe and trustworthy, and that food business operators, these are your customers, and that you ensure that you take every approach necessary to ensure that Listeria monocytogenes does not get into your food product. And part of that approach is really implementing a robust Listeria monocytogenes environmental monitoring, or an LEM program. Basically, this is just a risk-based written procedure, and it documents all the swabbing locations, the times the swabs are taken, the frequency of it, the swabbing protocols, etc. So the LEM program itself is not a control program, but rather it verifies that the other control programs you have in place under your food safety management system are working as they should be, and it verifies the effectiveness of those, in particular in preventing post-process contamination. The LEM program plays a critical role in detection, investigation, and management of Listeria monocytogenes in ready-to-eat food production. It also provides information about how those test results should be interpreted and what specific corrective actions should be taken if Listeria monocytogenes contamination is detected either in the environment, or maybe in raw materials, or potentially in food products. And lastly, implementing an LEM program is a legal requirement. Under Article 5.2 of Regulation 2073 of 2005 as amended, so this is the regulation that provides the microbiological criteria for foodstuffs. It says that food business operators manufacturing ready-to-eat foods which may pose a Listeria monocytogenes risk for public health shall sample the processing area and equipment for Listeria monocytogenes as part of their sampling scheme. But that's all it says. It doesn't give any information on how to design an LEM program, where the samples should be taken, how they should be taken, how do you assess those test results for compliance, and most importantly, what do you do if you find Listeria monocytogenes in the environment, and how do you handle that positive detection? So this is where Guidance Note 45 comes in, and it was published by the FSAI earlier this year, and it really plugs that gap and provides a lot of guidance on those points. In addition, food business operators, particularly if you are new to setting up an LEM program, are recommended to get other complementary guidance. So one is an FSAI guidance document from 2005 that was written by our scientific committee, and it explains how to design a ready-to-eat food business operation to control and manage Listeria monocytogenes contamination of food. And then the second two documents explain how swabs for Listeria monocytogenes should be taken and when to swab. So this is published in ISO 18593, which is available on the ISO website. And this gives you a general overview of methods for surface sampling, so of equipment and surfaces, but it's not specific for Listeria monocytogenes. For that reason, the European Union Reference Lab for Listeria monocytogenes, the EURL for LM, they publish these accompanying guidelines that are specific for Listeria monocytogenes, and they give guidance on how to sample the food processing areas and equipment to best recover Listeria monocytogenes. So you need to have both documents. So you can see from my presentation, it's important that the risk of Listeria monocytogenes cross-contaminating to food needs to be controlled very closely. And for this reason, it's important to have a robust LEM program. Cross-contamination can occur at any step where the food is exposed to the environment. So for example, during processing, if the food is open to the environment before sealing in the final packaging. And it can occur in various ways, for example, through raw materials coming in, through personnel moving through the factory and maybe their footwear acting as a vector. Aerosols, particularly aerosols that are created through using high pressured hose pipes, contaminated utensils or equipment or water. As part of the LEM program, it really helps the food business understand where are those harbourage sites and growth niches and biofilms in the environment. And it's important to understand where they are so it allows effective control. And so measures can be put in place to limit persistence. And these are three terms that you hear mentioned a lot in relation to environmental control of Listeria monocytogenes and food business operations. So just to explain what those are. A biofilm is basically where Listeria monocytogenes cells aggregate together and they form this thin but very robust protective layer on the surface. And it provides a protection to extreme environmental stress, meaning that it increases the potential for Listeria monocytogenes to survive and grow in harbourage sites. The biofilm can protect the Listeria monocytogenes from being readily removed by surface cleaning and chemical disinfection treatment. So it allows it to persist for a long time in the environment of the food business operation, and that can go on to cross-contaminate the food. Harbourage sites are basically physical areas. So for example, it may be complex equipment with poor hygienic design and which Listeria monocytogenes can lodge, and they're protected from the external forces such as cleaning and disinfection. So they're more difficult to remove. A harbourage site that can become what's known as a growth niche. So if there is access to nutrients or water or temperature, for example, and there might be a lack of competition from other microorganisms, it can provide the ideal environment for growth for the Listeria monocytogenes. So again, it can survive and grow in the environment, and then it can go on to cross-contaminate the food. So to manage the risk of Listeria monocytogenes environmental contamination, it really requires going back to basic principles of making sure that you have a very strong application of good hygiene procedures or prerequisite programs and hazard analysis, critical control point based procedures. So together these make your food safety management system. And as I said, the LEM program then is a verification program. So it verifies that the control measures you have in place are optimized to minimize the transfer of Listeria monocytogenes to food. But basically, you have sort of three guiding principles. And the first is to not let Listeria monocytogenes into the factory in the first place. So make sure you have good barrier controls in place and good procedures to limit the movement of people, from the ready to eat and into the non-ready to eat area or vice versa. The movement of equipment and food in the factory. It's also recommended to monitor Listeria monocytogenes periodically in your raw materials. If Listeria monocytogenes does get into your factory, make sure that your hygiene program is optimized to remove it from the surfaces or equipment. So make sure your hygiene program is fit for purpose, optimize your chemicals and your cleaning tools, monitor the effectiveness of your hygiene procedures. And if you do identify an issue, make sure it's addressed in a timely fashion. And then lastly, we talked about biofilms and harbourage sites. Make sure that you don't let Listeria monocytogenes stick in those areas that are maybe poor building fabrics, such as damaged floors or walls or work surfaces or drains, or maybe equipment poor hygienic design, such as slicers or packing machines or mixers. You may also hear a term called seek and destroy mentioned a lot in relation to environmental control of Listeria monocytogenes. And this is where it's accepted that Listeria monocytogenes is ubiquitous in the environment, so it's expected that sometimes it might be isolated from some areas in the operation, particularly drains, sometimes on footwear or through waste routes. So the seek and destroy mindset encourages that LEM team to actively look for and find Listeria monocytogenes and remove it and put in steps in place to prevent reoccurrence. They value positive findings as opportunities for a thorough investigation of the root cause, and that in turn results in continuous improvement. So the positive results should not be viewed on their own as a failure of the LEM programme, but rather used to strengthen and improve the overall food safety management system. And also just a note of caution, if you're always getting negative test results for the environment swabs that you're taking, sometimes that can give a false sense of security to the food business operator. And really make sure that your methods are robust, that you're looking for it in locations where it's likely to be found, that your procedures for actually taking the swabs are following the standards, that you're checking raw materials, and particularly if you're finding it in the end food product and not in the environment, really go back and check that you're doing your best to actually find it in the environment too. So look, it's clear to implement a robust LEM program that controlling Listeria monocytogenes is essential at all stages of the food production, from the raw materials coming in, the food processing that happens, and the end product going out the door. So an integrated approach is necessary to prevent cross-contamination and growth of the pathogen in the final food product. Senior management need to encourage an appropriate food safety culture that drives that seek and destroy mindset for Listeria monocytogenes. The LEM program should be designed on a risk basis and according to HACCP-based principles, and it's recognized that food business operations differ in terms of their size and the nature of the food that they make. So there's no one size that fits all. So really you need your own staff to assist in designing the LEM program and what works best and what makes most sense for your particular operation. It is recommended to include testing for all Listeria species, but recognizing that other Listeria species that are non-monocytogenous are not pathogenic, so the risk management actions may differ. But it's recommended to test for all Listeria species as a hygiene indicator, because the same environmental conditions that support the growth of Listeria species also could support the growth of Listeria monocytogenes. So moving on to Guidance Note 45, this is quite a comprehensive document that was written in conjunction with representatives from all different types of the food industry and food industry bodies and experts here in the Food Safety Authority. It's quite a robust document. It's very comprehensive. So I recommend you go to that document for the detail, because today I have a very short amount of time to talk to you. And as part of today's, I'm just going to cover the 6 steps to develop a successful LEM program. But if you're interested in this topic, I'd recommend you go to the guidance for the detail. The first step is to assemble an LEM team. So this should be a cross-functional team with expertise in food safety, operations, microbiology, and hygiene. So for example, you might have somebody who's a board member or a senior member, you might have somebody from operations, somebody from engineering, somebody from the quality or technical team, somebody from the hygiene team, and then somebody who's given the responsibility to be the sample collector. The roles and the responsibilities for each team member should be clearly defined and documented under your LEM program. For some of the smaller food business operations, it is recognized that you might not have as many staff members, so some of them may have overlapping responsibilities. So you might have a sample collector who's also part of the quality team or the operations team. It's important that the LEM team are given the authority by senior management to make decisions which will ensure effective and timely implementation of the LEM program. The second step is staff training. Staff training is a legal requirement under Regulation 852 of 2004 to train or supervise staff involved in food business operations commensurate with their work activities. So it's recommended to provide a general training on the risk of Listeria monocytogenes cross-contamination to food from the environment for all staff who are working in the right to eat areas. And in particular, this is good for staff to understand why it's important that they exactly follow the procedures as set out under their food safety management system. The LEM team members then should receive a more specific training regarding the risks of Listeria monocytogenes, and particularly some of the team members, maybe somebody from the engineering team, may not be as familiar with the risks of Listeria monocytogenes as others on the team. So it's good to really give a good, more robust training to those team members. And then lastly, a dedicated training is recommended for any of the staff members who are given the responsibility to act as sample collectors. Step 3 is to create a master swabbing schedule. And this is basically a list of all of the swabbing locations that should be monitored within the operation. The LEM team should use their expertise to determine what locations should be included in this list on a risk basis, and it'll vary for each FBO. To assist with creating this list, it's recommended to create what's called an LEM site form map. This is basically a map that has all the relevant information for the operation, where the ready-to-eat and the non-ready-to-eat areas are, where the fixed and mobile equipment is, how people move through the process or through the operation, product, packaging wastes, packaging flows, waste flows, where the barrier controls are, where the transfer points are, where the drains are, for example. So each swab location that's put on that master swabbing schedule should be given a unique swab reference number, and this is essential to ensure repeatability, and it can be useful to add it to the LEM site form map so you know exactly what that number corresponds to. The entire master swabbing schedule should be covered over a certain period of time, and that should be determined by the LEM team for what makes best sense for your business. So for some businesses, it might be a year. For others, it maybe it's 3 months. It depends on the type of business you have and how large it is. Guidance Note 45 in Appendix 3 has an example of a master swabbing schedule, and it also has a blank template that food business operators can take and make their own. And I suppose particularly for food businesses that maybe haven't put an LEM program together, this can be a useful starting point. Guidance Note 45 also has a simplified example of an LEM site floor map. And you can see here, this is just showing the different areas in the business, the flow of raw materials and product through the business, and the location of permanent and mobile equipment. So it is recognized that, you know, there's a lot of information to put on these maps. So it might make more sense to have a corresponding set of maps with different pieces of information on them. And Guidance Note 45 has an example of that. In terms of the swabbing locations, these are chosen by the LEM team based on their experience. So they may know there's a piece of equipment that there's some difficulty with keeping that hygienic and clean. So that might be something they decide to keep on their master swabbing schedule. So be based on their experience, but it also depends on the nature and the size of the food business operation. And it'll vary depending on the complexity of the process and the food being produced. So it should be selected on a risk basis, considering the FPO's own processing schedules. The ISO method and Guidance Note 45 provide some guidance and some ideas on areas you may want to consider to include. And then in terms of frequency, it depends on the significance of that location. So for some locations, maybe it's a food contact surface in a ready-to-eat area that's been identified that it could potentially contaminate product. You might assess that more frequently than maybe something in a lower risk area that's considered to be maybe not as likely to cross-contaminate food products. The time to take swabs is really essential to ensure the sensitivity and the robustness of your method. So both the ERL guidance and the ISO method recommend that you take the swabs during production towards the end of the shift to get the worst case scenario for environmental contamination. So it's recommended to take them at least 2 hours into production, or you can take them at the end of the production runs before cleaning and disinfection to get a sense of the worst case scenario. A small allocation of swabs can also be taken after the hygiene program has been implemented or just before production starts up again. And really the objective of that would be to validate the hygiene protocols in place. If you find that you're finding Listeria monocytogenes after the hygiene program has been implemented, it really indicates a serious failure in the hygiene procedures, and that would need to be addressed immediately. I also wanted to point out that if you're taking swabs during production, it's recommended to have no neutralizer added to those swabs because it can actually negatively impact your sensitivity of the swab to pick up Listeria monocytogenes. But if you're taking swabs after the hygiene program has been implemented, there are biocides on those surfaces, and that could potentially affect your ability to recover Listeria monocytogenes. So you need to add a neutralizer to those swabs to combat the effect of the biocides. In terms of the swabbing area, basically the larger the area, the better. It's recommended to sample between 1,000 to 3,000 centimeters squared in both the ERL guidance and the ISO method. And for that, you can use either, there's an example there of a sponge swab or a gauze swab. So basically you're using something that will kind of cover as much surface area as possible. You can also use the small cotton tip fixed swabs. So these are considered to be more suitable for small surfaces, so less than 100 centimeters squared. And typically these are used in difficult to reach areas. So maybe if you have an area that you think might have a biofilm, or it might be a known harborage site. So for example, if you have a crack in the floor, or if you have a piece of equipment that's known to be difficult to clean, you might use that to reach into those hard to reach areas. It's also important to remember to clean and disinfect the surfaces and equipment after swabbing. So you don't want to leave any culture media or neutralizer on those surfaces that might actually inadvertently encourage Listeria monocytogenes to grow if it is in the environment. As I mentioned, samples collectors really should be trained to swab areas in a consistent way for each location, and this will help results to be consistent and so they can be compared and trended. Particularly if you have a number of people acting as a sample collector within a food business operation, it means that the technique that the operator uses will have a negligible effect on the result. The guidance by the EURL and the ISO guidance gives information on how to take samples, and the EURL also have 3 nice short videos that show swabbing techniques for different types of swabs. And I have the link there, but also to mention that some of the links I'll be mentioning today will be circulated to the audience after this webinar. Step 4 is to trend the test results. So analysing trends and test results, it is a legal requirement under the regulation 2073. But it's also useful data that food business operators can use to identify the operational areas that are most affected by Listeria monocytogenes environmental contamination and where to focus your efforts in terms of corrective actions. It's recommended that any new test results that are received into the operation are promptly incorporated into the data set. And the LEM team should regularly review these. And if they see a trend towards unsatisfactory results, action should be taken in a timely fashion and appropriate action to prevent cross-contamination to food. You might also decide to carry out follow-up samples. Maybe if you had a contamination event in the food business operation and you implemented corrective action, you wanted to see if that was corrective action worked, you might carry out follow-up testing of that area. And if you do that, it's recommended to trend that data separately to avoid skewing your routine test results. Guidance note 45 has some examples of different ways that you can trend data. So you can use your LEM sitemap by adding a hotspot, so a dot for every time you find Listeria, or if you have quite a lot of Listeria in your environment, you might make more sense to add a percentage. You can just use a simple table, or in the Appendix 3 in that template, the Excel file, it gives examples for how you can use your master swabbing schedule to trend data. Step 5 is to establish corrective action procedures. So this is the actions that should be taken if you find Listeria monocytogenes in any of the swabbing locations on your master swabbing schedule or in food products. And those actions will differ depending on whether the Listeria monocytogenes is found in a food surface, contact surface, or a non-food contact surface, if it's in a high or a low risk area, if it's for Listeria monocytogenes or for Listeria species, and if it's for a presumptive or a confirmed test result. So document those corrective actions as part of the LEM program under your food safety management system. If you do find a positive, it's important to move then from routine to investigational procedures. The first thing you should do is assess and document if the Listeria monocytogenes potentially could have cross-contaminated to any of the batches of ready heat food that was made during that time frame. If you think there is a possibility of ready-to-eat food being unsafe because it's contaminated with Listeria monocytogenes, it's important that you notify your relevant competent authority immediately so appropriate risk management actions can be taken. The LEM team should also carry out a thorough investigation of the contamination event and with the aim of identifying the root cause of contamination so you can put in steps to prevent that happening again. And as part of that investigation, review your current good hygiene practices and your prerequisite programs on the hazard-based procedures to see are they fit for purpose, are they robust, and if not, ensure that the necessary modifications are made to prevent reoccurrence. Guidance note 45 has lots of ideas and examples of things that you might consider to include as your corrective actions in Table 7 and in Table 8. So you can go to the guidance for more details on that. Last step then is to review your LEM program regularly. So the LEM team would meet regularly, and depending on the business, what makes most sense for you in terms of meeting. So it could be weekly, could be daily, could be monthly. And the objective of this meeting is to discuss the test results and the trends, if you've done any corrective actions, were they effective, to plan for any upcoming changes. So maybe you're adding new equipment into the operation or there's building work scheduled to take place. As I mentioned, it is important that test results are incorporated into the data set and trended as soon as possible after receipt from the laboratory. And somebody should have the responsibility of noting if a Listeria monocytogenes is detected, that the correct people are notified on the LEM team to ensure timely corrective actions are implemented in accordance with your documented procedures in the LEM programme. It's also worthwhile routinely evaluating the effectiveness of your master swabbing schedule, and it'll grow and evolve over time and update it as needed. So you might find as you continue to test that maybe there's some locations on there that are not as high a value, and you're not, you might replace them with some other areas that you think would be a better return in terms of finding Listeria. So that seek and destroy approach. So when you've written your LEM program, document it as part of your food safety management system. So it should include information regarding the members of the LEM team and their respective roles and responsibilities, staff training protocols, for example. Document your master swabbing schedule, and this is really important, with detailed information on the locations to be swabbed, how frequently they're to be swabbed, the timing of the swabs to be taken, the swabbing procedures, how those test results are to be analysed, how they're to be trended, etc. And critically ensure that you've documented your corrective actions for Listeria monocytogenes, so you know what to do if Listeria monocytogenes is found in the environment or in food product. So coming to the end of the webinar now, and in conclusion, you can see the implementation of a robust LEM program is essential for identifying and managing and eliminating potential sources of Listeria monocytogenes in ready-to-eat food businesses. Effective control relies on a well-trained LEM team using an integrated approach by combining strong hygiene program with risk-based sampling, staff training, timely review of procedures and data trends, and consistent documentation. In addition, root cause analysis and timely implementation of corrective actions following detections are critical to prevent persistence and cross-contamination to ready-to-eat food. It's also important to note that a robust LEM program, particularly for ready-to-eat food that supports the growth of Listeria monocytogenes, is required to comply with your legal obligation to produce safe food. And as I said, this is a quick overview of the guidance today, but really go to the guidance for more details if you're interested in this topic. So I'd like to thank you for listening, and I welcome your questions.
It's great. Thanks very much for that information, Mary. Some great tips there and really good key takeaways. So we've a few questions coming in now. Thanks very much, everyone. And if anybody else would like to pop one in the box there, you're more than welcome to, and we'll do our very best to get to it. Okay, so the first one here, Mary, what advice would you give a food business that does not have the technical ability to develop an LEM program?
Thanks, Emma. So I suppose a lot of businesses, some are smaller businesses, they may feel they don't have the technical ability either to train their staff or maybe to put together an LEM program. So they might consider employing a third-party consultant or a third-party trainer. And if you're going to do that, really ensure that you employ somebody who has the appropriate expertise. Maybe ask other people through the food industry, a similar food industry, for references, for recommendations. And ensure that you engage that third-party supplier to have a good outcome in terms of putting together your training program or maybe your LEM program. And in particular for the LEM program, the food business operator really needs to have ownership of that. And you can see from my presentation today that the input from the staff members on the ground is critical to really understand that operation and get the best out of it. If you are employing a third party because maybe you have an LEM program in place and you have a persistent contamination issue with Listeria monocytogenes, you might be looking for external expertise because you can't get to the root cause of the problem. There is information in Guidance No. 45 in terms of employing somebody to help you with that situation, and there is recommendations for an opening meeting with such a consultant in Guidance No. 45.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Mary. Another one here. Would you recommend the use of whole genome sequencing when investigating the source of L-mono contamination?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a really good molecular tool that can help food businesses understand the types of contamination they have in their business and the types of Listeria monocytogenes strains that are circulating. So it'll give you information on whether you maybe have one persistent strain that's in the business, or could have a number of strains circulating. Maybe some of those are transient. So when it's combined with the metadata, so the metadata is the information on the swab locations, that were where the isolate was found. So what type of equipment, the area, etc. It really is very powerful, and it can help you understand and solve that puzzle, particularly around root cause analysis. So, you might have thought that the Listeria monocytosis came from the drain, but actually the whole genome sequencing is showing it came from raw material or a piece of equipment.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mary. I'll move on to the next one here. What lab method should the environmental swabs be tested with?
So they can use the ISO method, ISO 11290 Part 1, and this is more commonly known as the detection method. But food businesses can also use alternative validated methods. So these more like rapid methods can be used to test and just make sure that the method is suitable for environmental swabs as a test matrix.
Okay, and Mary, just following on from that, do you have any recommendations for employing a lab to test the samples?
Yes, so it's recommended as best practice to use the services of a accredited lab that's accredited to ISO 17025. And you can go to the INAB, that's the Irish National Accreditation Board, INAB, their directory to find a suitable lab. And in that, you'll see if they are accredited to test for environmental soils for Listeria monocytosis.
Okay, thanks, Mary. Okay, another one here. Can there be too much focus on swabbing drains as a potential source of contamination rather than considering drains as a collection point for LM?
Yeah, definitely. And there is a lot of that. You'll get that information in Guidance Note 45. But I think, particularly with food businesses, they find it in the drain and they think, oh, that's our root cause. But actually, they continue to have Listeria monocytosis in their food product. And it may be coming from a different source. So that's where, particularly with whole genome sequencing, can be very useful to try and solve that puzzle and see if the Listeria strain that you're finding in your food product is the same as the one in the drain.
Okay. And Mary, how many swabs should someone take per sampling session?
So it depends on the food business and the size of the operation. So it's best place for the LEM team to decide that. There is some guidance available, and in Guidance Note 45, we've collated that. But for smaller food businesses, between 5 to 10 swabs per sampling session is recommended. But for the larger businesses, you may consider taking more.
Brill. Okay. Another one here. For biofilm removal, is physical scrubbing effective?
Physical scrubbing, yeah, but also making sure that you're using the right chemicals. And I think for physical scrubbing, for some of the particularly complex equipment with poor hygienic design, you may need to look at full disassembly of that equipment. And cleaning instruction cards can be also really useful for operatives that are carrying out the hygiene program, so it's carried out in a consistent way. The chemicals, I would say, recommend to consult with your chemical provider, and they will really be best placed to give you advice around chemicals that would be most suitable for particularly biofilm removal.
Okay. Another interesting one in here from a fruit and veg business. Are fruit and veg businesses required to carry out testing, not processed all whole foods? We do RTE products like tomatoes, cucumbers, and peppers.
Okay, so for those types of products, in Regulation 2073, there is a footnote that says regular testing is not required for whole unprocessed fruit and veg. So for those types of products that are not pre-cut, they are falling into category 1.3, which is for right heat foods unable to support the growth of Listeria monocytosis, and regular testing is not expected. And as part of that, I suppose the regulation where it says that Listeria monocytosis environmental monitoring programs should be carried out, it says for Listeria's for right heat foods that are more likely to cause a risk for public health. So I'd say on that basis, potentially you don't need to carry out as an environmental monitoring program, but I think you kind of do what makes most sense for you as a food business.
Okay, thanks for that answer, Mary. Just a couple more here that we'll get to. I've worked with a certain type of swab machines before, but the term neutralizer is not familiar. Could you explain what you mean?
So basically, it's just a chemical to combat the effect of biocides. So in the ISO standard and in the ERL guidance, they recommend to add a neutralizer, which is basically just a chemical that it stops the effect of biocides. So if you're swabbing to check that your hygiene program is working properly, you can expect that there might be biocide residue on the surface. And the neutralizer will just stop that action, so that you're more likely to recover Listeria monstogenous if it's there. And then equally, if you're taking your swabs during production and you use a swab that has neutralizer in it, it can actually negatively impact your sensitivity of the swab, because it's a balancing act, I suppose. The neutralizer can negatively affect the Listeria monstogenous. So if you go to the ISO method and the URL guidance as well, there's more information on using neutralizers.
Okay, thanks for explaining that, Mary. Another one here. What is the recommended action if a non-monolisteria species is detected? Does this trigger additional testing, root cause investigation, or corrective actions?
So I suppose it depends on where the Listeria species has been detected. If you're finding it in a higher risk area, maybe on a food contact surface, you're testing it as a hygiene indicator. It's indicating that potentially Listeria monstogenous could also be there. So I would follow the same actions in your corrective action plan in terms of root cause analysis, etc. The only thing that would be different is if you find Listeria species in a food product, it's not a legal breach. So the risk management actions, there would be no recall expected, for example.
Okay. Another one here. I was wondering this myself as well. Do you expect more LM detection in food products with the change in Regulation 2073 from the 1st July?
It depends. I suppose we don't really know. What I expect is that food business operators will improve their food safety management systems, and that in turn might trigger an increase in Listeria detections because more sampling is taking place. I suppose the amendment that was introduced was really to plug that legislative gap where there was a less sensitive criteria for food placed on the market. So it's a more sensitive test method for some of those products. For ready-to-eat food that the food business operator has no evidence to show that if Listeria monstogenous was in that food, it wouldn't grow beyond 100 CFU per gram throughout the shelf life. They are now expected to comply with the not detected in 25 grams of product placed on the market. And for some of those food businesses, maybe they didn't have such robust controls in place. So I really would urge businesses to put their money into improving the food safety management system, which includes implementing a strong LEM program. And as a result of that, we may see some additional non-compliance compared to previous years, but it's really hard to tell.
Okay. Mary, we might squeeze one more in.
Yep.
We're not going to have time to get to the rest. I'm really sorry. So the last one, is there a recommended ratio between environmental and product testing with the new legislation? Our product testing seems excessive.
Okay. There's not. And I think that's where you go back to designing it on a risk basis. So as part of the LEM team, I think it's probably not prescriptive in the legislation because it differs for each food business. So you're saying that your food product testing is excessive compared to the environmental monitoring. I think the general guideline is that you would do quite a bit of environmental monitoring. So maybe, 2/3 environmental, 1/3 product testing, but then sometimes the product testing has been carried out as part of customer specification. So you need to balance that as well. But I think it's the LEM team that should make that decision. So you go back to square one, you think about your business, what are the risks, what makes sense in terms of how much environmental swabbing you do and how much food product testing you do.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Mary. And thanks to everyone for joining today's Breakfast Bite. So after we finish today, you'll receive a follow-up email after the webinar with the links to all the resources referenced during the session. And I know a few people asked, would you get the presentation? But you won't get the presentation slides, but you will get the recording, which is even better. So we'd also encourage you all to explore the FSAI's learning portal if you haven't already done so. It offers a range of free training courses, guidance and learning resources to help you stay up to date with food safety. The materials are designed to fit around busy schedules and can be completed at your own pace or used as part of staff training and team meetings. So a huge thank you as well to our colleagues behind the scenes for keeping everything running smoothly today. So please continue the conversation on social media if you like, using hashtag FSAI events, and take a moment to complete the short survey that appears at the end of this. Your feedback helps us shape future events to your needs. If you'd like to stay up to date with upcoming breakfast bites and other FSAI events, please subscribe to our alerts. We can pop a link in the chat. And for any questions we didn't get to today, I did mention the portal earlier. You could pop into that, and the resources that we're going to send afterwards, have a look at those. But if your question still hasn't been answered, you can email info@fsai.ie and we'll make sure to follow up. So I think one of the key takeaways from today is stay ahead of Listeria with effective monitoring, timely action and strong controls. So thanks again to Mary for her insights and to all of you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at the next Breakfast Bite. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma.